I never imagined that the sentence that would shake my entire life wouldn't come from a lawyer, a bank, or a doctor, but from an angry voice cutting through my sleep at 2 in the morning, sharp enough to feel physical, saying my name like it was already guilty, already convicted, already done, followed by a warning so confident it made me sit straight up in bed before my mind could even catch up. Stop throwing parties at your house every night. Enough is enough. For a few seconds, I genuinely thought I was still dreaming because the accusation made no sense at all, not even a little, not even metaphorically. And yet the voice on the other end didn't sound confused. It sounded fed up, exhausted, and furious, the way people sound only after they believe they've been patient for far too long. My heart began pounding, not out of fear, but out of disbelief, because I wasn't even in that house, not tonight, not this week, not ever since I'd finalized the purchase. And the idea that someone could accuse me so confidently of something I physically could not have done made my stomach tight in a way I couldn't explain. I tried to respond calmly, tried to slow the moment down, tried to anchor reality back into the conversation, telling him where I actually was, that I lived hours away, that the house he was talking about was empty, untouched, waiting for me to move in properly. But the more I explained, the angrier he became, as if my denial itself was an insult, as if my calmness proved how careless and entitled I must be. He told me the street was overflowing with unfamiliar cars, that music was shaking the walls of houses where people had lived peacefully for decades, that laughter and shouting had replaced the sound of waves, and that he had already waited long enough, which was terrifying because when someone says they've already waited, it means they're done asking. What scared me wasn't the threat of police or complaints, it was the certainty in his voice, the way he spoke like a man who had watched this happen repeatedly and had finally reached the end of his tolerance. And that certainty made me question myself for half a second, not because I thought I was wrong, but because I started wondering how reality could fracture so cleanly that two people could be standing on completely opposite truths at the same time. I had worked for years, no, decades, for that house, sacrificing weekends, sleep, relationships, comfort, pouring everything into a future that finally felt solid enough to touch. And now, without ever stepping foot inside it as its owner, I was being accused of turning it into a nightly nightmare for strangers I hadn't even met yet. The call ended abruptly, not with resolution, but with a final warning that echoed in the silence of my bedroom long after the line went dead. And as I stared at the dark ceiling, my thoughts raced faster than my body could keep up, cycling through possibilities that all felt wrong, wrong keys, wrong address, wrong assumptions, except none of them explained how someone could be so specific, so detailed, so certain. That was when the unease crept in, quiet and cold, the kind that doesn't announce itself with panic but with logic, because logic told me something was happening in my house without my knowledge, and the longer I stayed frozen in bed trying to rationalize it, the more time whoever was responsible had to keep doing whatever they were doing. I told myself not to overreact, told myself there had to be a simple explanation, but deep down I could feel the shift, the moment when confusion begins hardening into something heavier, something closer to dread, because you don't get threatened in the middle of the night over nothing, and peaceful neighborhoods don't erupt without a cause. With shaking hands, not from fear, but from the kind of adrenaline that comes when your instincts start screaming before your mind catches up, I reached for my phone again, not to call anyone, not to argue, not to defend myself, but to check something I had installed precisely so I would never have to rely on trust alone. The house was equipped with cameras, not because I expected betrayal, but because hard work teaches you one thing early: never assume peace will protect what you've built. As the app loaded, second by second, stretching far longer than they should have, I braced myself for something, anything, that would explain how my name had become attached to chaos I didn't create, but nothing prepared me for the image that finally appeared on my screen, because the moment I saw it, every trace of confusion vanished, replaced by a single, sickening realization that made my chest feel hollow. The house wasn't empty at all, and whoever was inside it knew exactly what they were doing. And when I recognized the face at the center of it all, I understood something even worse than the damage itself. This wasn't a mistake. This was personal. I always believed there were only two kinds of fear: the kind you feel when something might happen, and the kind you feel when something already has, but nothing prepared me for the third kind. The kind that creeps in when you're forced to watch disaster unfold in real time while being completely powerless to stop it. Because as the security feed finally sharpened into focus on my phone, the first thing I noticed wasn't the noise or the movement, but the wrongness of it all, the way my pristine living room looked unfamiliar, distorted, like a stranger wearing my home as a costume. And then the sound hit me. Muffled but unmistakable, music pounding so aggressively it seemed to vibrate through the screen itself, followed by laughter that felt invasive, the kind that doesn't belong somewhere it's echoing. My eyes darted across the footage, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, because my mind kept insisting there had to be a mistake, but every frame erased that hope piece by piece. Revealing bodies sprawled across furniture I hadn't even sat on yet, shoes grinding into floors I had polished by hand, drinks sloshing recklessly near surfaces that had taken months of planning and saving to choose. And the more I watched, the more it felt like I was witnessing a crime scene in slow motion, except the crime wasn't happening after the fact. It was still ongoing, still laughing, still dancing. I zoomed in, not because I wanted details, but because my brain was desperately searching for logic, for something that would explain how strangers had turned my empty house into their personal playground. And that's when my stomach dropped, because suddenly these weren't strangers anymore, not entirely, not when I recognized familiar mannerisms, familiar movements. The way someone tilted their head when they laughed or exaggerated their gestures for attention. And recognition is always more painful than surprise, because surprise fades quickly, but recognition burns. The camera shifted to another angle automatically, as if the house itself were trying to show me everything I needed to see, and there it was, the kitchen, the heart of the home. The space I had designed with obsessive care because it represented years of struggle and discipline, now reduced to chaos, countertops cluttered with greasy boxes, bottles stacked carelessly beside imported stone I hadn't even properly christened yet, and watching food and drink spill where only intention was supposed to exist made my throat tighten in a way I hadn't expected. Because I realized this wasn't just about money or damage, it was about disrespect on a level that felt almost intimate. The camera cut again, this time to the terrace, and I felt a sharp twist of anger as I saw bodies crowded into a space meant for quiet mornings and ocean air, strangers laughing, splashing, shouting, treating the view like a backdrop rather than a privilege. And in that moment, I understood why my neighbor's voice had sounded the way it did. This wasn't an occasional inconvenience, it was a full-scale invasion, loud enough to erase the identity of the place entirely. I told myself to stop watching, that seeing more would only make it worse, but curiosity mixed with dread is a powerful thing, and I kept scrolling through angles, room after room revealing the same truth in different ways. Until I finally saw the one person who made everything click, standing at the center of it, all with the kind of confidence only entitlement can give you, moving through the house like it belonged to them, laughing loudly, performing for an audience that hung on every exaggerated word. The realization didn't come as a scream or a breakdown. It came as a quiet, sinking certainty, the kind that settles into your bones and doesn't leave, because betrayal rarely announces itself dramatically. It simply steps forward and waits for you to notice. As I watched, a strange duality took over my thoughts, one part of me cataloging the damage with cold precision, already calculating what could be fixed and what couldn't, while another part reeled at the emotional weight of it all. Because seeing your hard work disrespected in person is painful, but seeing it reduced to entertainment for others is something else entirely, something that makes you feel smaller in a way you can't articulate. Every few seconds brought a new violation, someone opening drawers that had never been opened, someone leaning against walls I had carefully chosen colors for, someone treating objects that symbolized milestones in my life like disposable props. And with each new image, something inside me hardened, not into rage yet, but into resolve, because rage burns hot and fast, but resolve is cold and enduring. I realized then that this wasn't just about stopping a party or even reclaiming a house. It was about reclaiming control over a narrative that was already being written without my consent, because as long as this continued, I wasn't just the owner of a vandalized property. I was the invisible antagonist in someone else's story, the absent figure whose silence made the lie possible. I noticed a phone raised toward a camera, noticed exaggerated gestures meant for an unseen audience, and it dawned on me that this chaos wasn't accidental. It was performative, designed to be seen, shared, admired, which meant the damage extended beyond walls and floors into reputation and perception, into spaces I couldn't clean or repaint. That realization changed everything, because when destruction becomes content, stopping it requires more than confrontation. It requires strategy, patience, and proof. My hands stopped shaking not because I felt calm, but because clarity has a way of steadying you, and in that clarity I understood something crucial. This wasn't just happening to me. It was happening because of someone who believed they could take what I built and wear it like a costume without consequence. I saved the footage not out of fear, but out of foresight, because evidence isn't about revenge, it's about truth, and truth has a way of outlasting noise. As the screen continued to show my house being dismantled piece by piece, I felt a shift inside myself, a quiet but irreversible decision forming beneath the shock and disbelief. Because watching is what you do when you still hope things will resolve themselves, and hope, I realized, had already expired the moment I saw who was responsible. And once I accepted that this wasn't random chaos but deliberate entitlement, I knew the next step wasn't calling for help. It was deciding how far I was willing to go to stop it. People love to say that family is everything, that blood creates an unbreakable bond. But nobody ever tells you what to do when that bond becomes the very thing strangling you. Because as I sat there staring at my phone, watching my house be dismantled by people who felt far too comfortable inside it, something inside me finally snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, in the way things break when they've been under pressure for far too long. My mind drifted backward, not by choice, but by instinct, replaying years I rarely allowed myself to revisit. Years defined by early mornings, burned hands, aching feet, and a level of exhaustion that seeps into your bones and never fully leaves. Because nothing about my life had been handed to me, not the career, not the security, and certainly not that house. I remembered the nights I stayed late when everyone else went home, the weekends I didn't take, the relationships I let fade because survival demanded focus. And through all of it, there was always an unspoken expectation hovering in the background that because I endured, because I succeeded, I would naturally become the safety net for everyone else. At first, it didn't bother me. Helping felt natural, almost necessary, because saying no felt like betrayal, and I convinced myself that generosity was proof of character, that tolerance was maturity, that swallowing resentment made me stronger. But watching the footage, watching laughter echo through rooms built on years of sacrifice, I finally saw the pattern I had refused to acknowledge. This wasn't appreciation, it was entitlement, carefully disguised as closeness. The people inside my house weren't acting cautiously or gratefully. They were acting boldly, recklessly, as if they had never once questioned whether they belonged there, and that confidence didn't come from permission. It came from years of being enabled. I realized then that this wasn't the first line that had been crossed. It was just the most visible one, the moment when all the smaller compromises I had made finally stacked high enough to collapse under their own weight. My thoughts turned cold and sharp as I remembered every time I'd been told I was too serious, too rigid, too obsessed with work, every joke that framed my discipline as something laughable, something outdated, something to be exploited rather than respected, and suddenly the narrative made sense. To them, my effort wasn't something to honor, it was something to benefit from. The house wasn't a home in their eyes, it was a symbol, a trophy they could claim without earning, proof that proximity to success mattered more than the work itself. And that realization hurt more than the damage, more than the mess, because it meant this wasn't a misunderstanding or a lapse in judgment. It was a belief system, one where my boundaries were optional and my silence was consent. As I continued watching, my anger didn't explode the way movies teach you to expect. Instead, it condensed, becoming heavy and controlled, the kind of anger that doesn't rush but waits, the kind that plans. I understood then that confronting this emotionally would get me nowhere, because emotion is exactly what people like this rely on, what they weaponize to shift blame and avoid responsibility. And for the first time, I stopped asking myself how this could happen and started asking myself why I had allowed the conditions for it to happen in the first place. That question wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary because it forced me to see my own role, not in the betrayal, but in the tolerance that preceded it. I had spent so long proving that I could endure anything that I forgot endurance isn't the same as self-respect, and watching strangers toast to their good fortune inside a space that had cost me everything made that difference painfully clear. I thought about how easy it would be to rationalize this, to downplay it as family drama, to clean up the mess quietly and move on like I always had. But something about that idea felt unbearable now, not because it would be difficult, but because it would confirm the very narrative that put me in this position to begin with, that my role was to absorb, forgive, and provide no matter the cost. The truth settled in slowly but firmly. If I let this go, it wouldn't end here. It would escalate because people who face no consequences don't stop, they expand. And in that moment, as I saved more footage and watched the chaos continue unchecked, I realized that the line between family and liability had already been crossed long before tonight. Tonight was simply the first time I was forced to look at it without excuses. The weight of that understanding pressed down on me, heavy but clarifying, because once you accept that someone values access to your life more than respect for it, the question stops being why are they doing this and becomes why should I keep allowing it. I took a slow breath, feeling something unfamiliar but solid take shape inside me, not guilt, not hesitation, but certainty. And I knew that whatever happened next would change more than just this night. It would redefine where my responsibility ended and where my boundaries finally began. And once that decision settled in, there was no going back, because watching from a distance was no longer an option, and staying silent would only make me complicit in my own erasure. There's a moment when anger stops being loud and becomes precise, and that moment arrived not with shouting or tears, but with a calm so sharp it felt almost unnatural, because as I moved from watching to acting, I understood that this confrontation could no longer stay private, not if I wanted it to end cleanly and permanently. The drive felt unreal, like my body was moving through space faster than my thoughts could catch up, my mind replaying fragments of the footage on a loop while another part of me focused on details that suddenly mattered more than emotions, time stamps, camera angles, entry points, because when chaos spills into the real world, facts become armor. By the time I arrived, the noise confirmed everything my neighbor had said and more, music bleeding into the night air, laughter spilling across property lines, the house glowing unnaturally bright against the darkness like a beacon of arrogance. And for a brief second, I stood there absorbing the scale of it all, not as an owner reclaiming space, but as someone stepping into a lie that had been allowed to grow unchecked. The moment I crossed the threshold, the atmosphere shifted, not because people recognized me immediately, but because authority has a way of announcing itself even before it's acknowledged. And as eyes turned and whispers spread, I felt the weight of being both invisible and hypervisible at the same time, the unwanted interruption in someone else's fantasy. What struck me most wasn't the mess anymore. It was the audacity, the way people moved through the space without hesitation. as if ownership were something you could claim by presence alone. And when I finally locked eyes with the person at the center of it all, I didn't feel rage, I felt confirmation, because the confidence on their face wasn't the confidence of someone confused or mistaken. It was the confidence of someone who truly believed this confrontation would end the way all the others had, with deflection, excuses, and me backing down. The first words exchanged didn't matter as much as the tone, casual and dismissive on one side, measured and deliberate on mine, because tone reveals intent long before facts are introduced, and I could already see the strategy unfolding to frame me as overreacting, emotional, unreasonable, while positioning themselves as carefree, misunderstood, and unfairly targeted. That's when I understood that this wasn't just about reclaiming my home. It was about reclaiming reality itself, because when lies are spoken confidently enough, they don't need evidence to spread, they just need witnesses. I moved through the space slowly, not to intimidate, but to observe, to let the contrast speak for itself, the disarray against my composure, the noise against my silence. And when I stopped the music, the sudden quiet felt almost violent, not because silence is loud, but because it forces attention where it's been carefully avoided. Faces turned fully toward me then, irritation flashing into uncertainty, because chaos thrives on momentum, and the moment you interrupt that momentum, people are forced to reckon with what they're actually doing. Accusations flew, dismissals followed, ownership was claimed without proof, family was invoked as a shield, and for a brief moment, the situation teetered on the edge of becoming exactly what they wanted it to be: messy, emotional, and impossible to untangle. But instead of arguing, I waited, because waiting in moments like that isn't weakness. It's strategy, and when the authorities arrived, the shift was immediate. Laughter collapsing into panic, confidence dissolving into confusion, because reality has a way of reasserting itself when consequences walk through the door. The narrative they had built so carefully began to crack under simple questions, under requests for proof rather than stories. And as documents were produced and footage presented, I watched something fascinating happen. The same people who had been loud and bold moments earlier suddenly became small, defensive, desperate to reposition themselves as victims rather than participants. I didn't celebrate that shift, didn't savor it, because what mattered wasn't their discomfort. It was the clarity that emerged as facts replaced theatrics, as truth stripped away performance. When the situation reached its breaking point, when responsibility could no longer be dodged or reframed, the finality of it all settled in, heavy and irreversible, because once consequences become official, there's no undoing the moment that exposed everything. Standing there, watching authority assert itself where entitlement once ruled, I felt something loosen inside me. Not relief, not satisfaction, but release. The kind that comes when you finally stop carrying something that was never yours to hold. And as the night shifted from chaos to control, I realized that whatever happened next, whatever stories were told afterward, this confrontation had already changed the trajectory of everything, because the lie had been dragged into the open, and once exposed, it could never return to the comfort of the dark. I thought that would be the end of it. But what happened next proved that public consequences don't silence people like this. They only push them to rewrite the story. I learned very quickly that silence doesn't always mean peace, especially in a world where narratives move faster than facts, because just when I allowed myself to believe that the worst was behind me, my phone began to vibrate with a frequency that felt wrong, not random notifications, but a steady cascade that signaled something spreading beyond my control. At first, I ignored it, telling myself that exhaustion was distorting my judgment, that whatever noise existed outside my immediate reality could wait. But the longer it continued, the more I understood that this wasn't noise, it was a counterattack. When I finally looked, I saw it instantly, a carefully crafted story already gaining traction, one that twisted the events of the night into something almost unrecognizable, framing chaos as innocence and accountability as cruelty. And in that moment, I understood just how dangerous a confident lie can be when it's wrapped in emotion and released into the public without context. The version being told wasn't about trespassing or destruction or entitlement. It was about betrayal, about family, about someone being unfairly treated by a cold, successful figure who had forgotten where they came from, and reading it felt surreal. Like watching someone else wear your face while speaking words you'd never said. The comments multiplied faster than I could read them, people choosing sides based on fragments, projecting their own experiences onto a story they had no stake in. And what struck me most wasn't the hostility. It was how easily certainty formed in the absence of truth, how quickly strangers decided who deserved sympathy without ever questioning what they were being shown. I could have responded immediately, could have defended myself in real time, but something held me back, not fear, not hesitation, but an understanding that reacting emotionally would only validate the narrative being built against me, because outrage feeds outrage, and public sympathy is rarely won by shouting louder than the other side. Instead, I watched, quietly cataloging the patterns, noticing how repetition turned speculation into belief, how emotional language replaced factual inquiry, and how the same people who demanded proof from one side accepted claims from the other without question. It would have been easy to see this as unfair, to feel overwhelmed by the sheer volume of opinion crashing down all at once. But beneath the frustration, there was clarity, because I had something the narrative didn't: time-stamped reality, unedited evidence, moments captured without filters or excuses. I realized then that this wasn't about winning an argument online. It was about deciding whether truth would be allowed into the conversation at all, and that decision required restraint, not impulse. As the posts continued to circulate, becoming more dramatic with each retelling, I noticed something else happening beneath the surface. Small cracks in the story, inconsistencies that didn't quite line up, questions beginning to surface from people who weren't satisfied with emotional appeals alone, and those cracks told me everything I needed to know. The lie was fragile. Lies often appear strong at first because they're designed to shock, but they collapse under their own weight when exposed to light, and light, I understood, doesn't rush, it arrives deliberately. I prepared quietly, not to retaliate, but to respond, organizing what I already had into something undeniable. Because if I was going to speak, I would speak once, clearly, and with proof that left no room for reinterpretation. The temptation to explain myself was strong, to plead for understanding, but I refused it because explanation invites debate, and debate is exactly where truth gets diluted. What I was preparing wasn't a defense. It was a reveal, and reveals don't ask for permission. As the noise reached its peak, as speculation hardened into outrage and outrage demanded a villain, I felt strangely calm, because the louder the false story became, the more devastating the truth would be when it finally arrived. I knew that once the evidence was released, there would be no going back, no comfortable middle ground where people could pretend both sides were equally flawed. And that finality carried weight, because truth doesn't just correct misinformation, it forces accountability. Holding my phone, watching the last wave of distorted sympathy crest, I made the decision that would end the performance entirely, not by arguing, not by explaining, but by letting reality speak in its own unfiltered language, knowing full well that once it did, nothing and no one would be able to hide behind emotion again. And when I finally pressed post, I didn't add a single explanation, because the truth didn't need one, and what happened next unfolded faster than anyone expected. The moment the truth entered the conversation, it didn't arrive gently or politely. It hit like a sudden change in gravity, pulling everything back down to reality at once, because within minutes of releasing the evidence, the tone shifted so sharply it was almost disorienting, sympathy evaporating and certainty reversing direction as people realized they hadn't been misled by complexity, but by confidence masquerading as innocence. What struck me most wasn't the outrage that followed, but how quiet it became on the other side, how quickly certainty dissolved when faced with unedited footage that didn't argue, didn't accuse, and didn't exaggerate, but simply showed what had happened exactly as it occurred. The same voices that had demanded compassion now demanded explanations. The same people who had defended recklessness now distanced themselves from it. And watching that shift unfold confirmed something I had always believed but never fully experienced. Truth doesn't need momentum, it creates it. As the clips circulated, stripped of commentary and left to speak for themselves, the narrative collapsed in real time, not because I said anything new, but because the story being told could no longer survive contact with reality. And in that collapse, something even more revealing happened. Those who had once been united by convenience began turning on each other. Messages surfaced, recordings emerged, fragments of conversations released not out of honesty, but out of self-preservation, because when consequences become unavoidable, loyalty becomes optional. People scrambled to separate themselves from the lie, insisting they had been misled, pressured, manipulated. And while I had no interest in their excuses, I noted the pattern with detached clarity, because it exposed the fragile foundation of relationships built on entitlement rather than integrity. The focus shifted quickly from me to the person who had orchestrated the performance, and with that shift came a kind of poetic inevitability. As sponsors disappeared, public support vanished, and the carefully curated image began to unravel thread by thread. I didn't feel triumphant watching it happen. I felt grounded because this wasn't about revenge or public humiliation. It was about alignment, about reality finally catching up to behavior that had been insulated from consequence for far too long. As the dust settled online, I took the final step offline, not impulsively, but deliberately, because truth isn't complete until it's acknowledged where it matters most. Legal processes began quietly, efficiently, without spectacle, and that contrast alone spoke volumes, because while lies need noise to survive, accountability thrives in structure and documentation. Each action taken wasn't fueled by anger, but by necessity, by the understanding that boundaries only hold if they're enforced consistently. And for the first time, I wasn't carrying the emotional burden of being reasonable at my own expense. There were moments when the weight of it all pressed in, when the finality of severed ties and public fallout felt heavier than expected. But those moments passed quickly, replaced by a calm that came from knowing there was nothing left to clarify, nothing left to defend. The story no longer belonged to speculation or performance. It belonged to records, rulings, and reality. As the consequences became official and the chaos gave way to resolution, I felt something I hadn't anticipated, not closure, but freedom, because closure implies an ending you wait for, while freedom is something you claim. Standing there, watching the situation transform from spectacle to fact, I understood that this wasn't just the end of a lie. It was the end of a dynamic that had thrived on my silence, and silence, I realized, had never protected me. It had only protected those willing to abuse it. But even after the truth won publicly and legally, one final chapter remained, because consequences don't always feel complete until you see what they leave behind. Peace doesn't arrive with applause or validation, and it doesn't feel dramatic when it finally settles in. It comes quietly, almost unnoticed at first, in the small moments when you realize your chest no longer tightens at the sound of a notification, and your mind no longer rehearses arguments that don't need to be had, because as the weeks passed after everything unraveled, what surprised me most wasn't how much had changed around me, but how much had changed inside me. The house returned to what it was always meant to be, not a symbol, not a stage, not a battleground, but a place of stillness. And walking through it in the early mornings, with sunlight replacing chaos and silence replacing noise, I felt the weight I'd been carrying for years finally lift, not because justice had been served publicly, but because I had finally drawn a line that couldn't be crossed again. There were no more explanations demanded, no more apologies requested, no more expectations placed on me to fix what I didn't break. and that absence felt strange at first, like a muscle relaxing after being clenched for too long. Because when you've lived in survival mode, calm can feel unfamiliar. I thought often about how easily I had confused obligation with love in the past, how I had believed that endurance was proof of loyalty, and how that belief had slowly trained others to treat my effort as something owed rather than earned. Letting go of that mindset wasn't a single decision. It was a series of quiet affirmations, each one reinforcing the idea that protecting your life doesn't make you heartless, it makes you honest. The aftermath wasn't perfect or painless. Relationships ended, illusions dissolved, and there were moments of loneliness that came with choosing self-respect over familiarity. But even those moments carried a clarity I'd never known before, because loneliness born from boundaries is lighter than connection built on sacrifice. The world moved on, attention shifted elsewhere as it always does, but I remained, grounded in a space that finally reflected the effort behind it. And in that space, I found something far more valuable than vindication: control over my own narrative. Conversations became simpler, sleep came easier, and decisions no longer felt like negotiations between who I was and who I was expected to be, because that expectation had lost its power the moment I stopped feeding it. Standing on the terrace one morning, watching the horizon shift from gray to gold, I realized that what I had gained wasn't just peace. It was permission to exist without apology, permission to enjoy what I built without guilt, permission to say no without justifying it. The storm had passed, not because everything was restored to how it was before, but because I was no longer willing to live in a version of my life where chaos was normalized and respect was optional. And in that quiet, with nothing demanding my attention and no one asking me to compromise myself for their comfort, I understood something that felt both simple and profound. Protecting your boundaries doesn't make you alone, it makes you free. And freedom, unlike approval, is something no one can ever take from you again.